Click. Hello? 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 Yeah, Shuda. Oh, yeah, Shoda. Ha.
Hello.
Hi, that's Anisha. How are you?
I'm well, Tapela. How are you?
I'm very well, very well.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was an IGG foreign policy webinar,
Yes.
and we just ran a bit over time. So I was trying to go catch my breath and get another bottle of water.
No, 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 it is fine. I think we were able to get in on time, so it's not a problem.
Okay.
So we're just waiting
So
for.
how?
Yes?
No, Karen.
No, we're just waiting for one. At one, then we'll start with the seminar. I will be chairing the session, but you know, this is organized by myself and Dr. Nyoka there, who's also in. So the structure is such that at least for the first 30 minutes, you make a presentation or you give us a talk. I mean, if you want more time, that would be fine. But once you hit the 30-minute mark, I'm going to just stop you for a little bit and say 5 more minutes left.
Okay.
But thereafter, there will be Q&A sessions.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. Approximately how many participants we're looking at?
So I was not in yesterday because I was just in the air. But this week we've had quite a number. We've hit the ceiling at 300.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, it's mostly our students, both undergrad and postgrad. Then there would be a few staff members.
Okay.
But for the most part, yes, your audience is students or are students.
Okay.
So you could pitch it at that level. But yeah, so we could, yes.
Do you just only want me to focus on Mozambique and what South Africa's positioning is there, or kind of broaden it out to, excuse me, the kind of regional dynamic?
I think it would be great if you broadened it out, if you're comfortable with that. Because at least I think the speakers have delved in quite on the issues around the sort of socio-economic indices in Mozambique. So it would be great to have a regional perspective in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, so we'll start in 5 minutes time, you know. So we can grab some tea or coffee for those who are coffee lovers. Yeah. Thank you again.
Okay. No, it's fine. No, it's fine. No, and it comes up nicely because we just finished this webinar on South Africa and the world, and we were looking at value propositions in foreign policy.
I see.
So it intersects nicely with some of the points I'll make here, which I'll bring from that discussion. But just, you know, what is South Africa's foreign policy in the current trajectory of issues? So if you're talking, you know, positioning in the world, what is positioning in the region? And then we'll take it from there.
Okay. No, that sounds fantastic. That sounds proper. I also got your number from Matlala. I hope you don't mind.
No, it's fine. No, Matt is fine. That's great. No worries. But we must get you guys to join our South Africa and the World mailing list or the IGD mailing list. So I'll give it to my colleague, Arena. So when we have the next one, or even the one that's that we had today, which will be made available, the recording, then you can have access to it and you can hear some of the stuff that we were talking about. looking at the intersection between domestic and foreign policy, looking at the quality and the qualitative dynamics.
Oh, just one more thing. We're also recording this.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Have you got a Twitter account?
Yeah, let me put it for you in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I think we can begin. First, we are coming to the end of the 2021 teaching series. I want to thank everybody that has made it thus far. I think the week has been quite important to understand the both social and political, if not also economic dynamics going on in Mozambique. I want to also thank the students for honoring the invite. To you also, Sanyisha, also thank you for coming through today. I think we should be ending the teaching on a very high note. Just to also introduce the students to you, just a brief bio. So Sanyisha Naidu is a foreign policy analyst. Her interests include democratization in Africa, on Africa's political economy and development, Africa's relations with emerging powers from the South, South African foreign policy analysis, and the role of Track 2 diplomacy in international relations. She holds a master's in international relations from the University of Staffordshire in the United Kingdom, and has previously worked at the Center for Conflict Resolution based in Cape Town, and managed the South African Foreign Policy Initiative at the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. In the past, she has also managed a project that focused on Africa's international relations with China and emerging powers based in Faham from 2008 to 2010. And she has extensive publication record, which includes 2 edited volumes on Africa-China relations. Ms. Naidu is also a regular media commentator on both national and international platforms for major news agencies, including Al Jazeera News, CCTV, BBC Radio, SABC, and CBS Africa. She's also a regular analyst on South Africa's domestic politics, and electoral trends. Today, she will be giving a talk on South African policy objectives in Mozambique, of course, also with a particular focus on the regional dynamics and the regional response to Mozambique. I'm gonna give it to you now, Sanyisha, to take us through the presentation. Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here today. I always like the engagement with students and universities. It's a passion of mine. So wherever I can, I'm always grateful for the opportunity, and thanks to Capello and Bongani for affording me the opportunity. And I really think that engaging with the university community, with students and academics, etc., is a very humbling but a very enlightening experience. With the work that we do at the Institute for Global Dialogue, where I'm based, it's constantly with policymakers and practitioners, and sometimes I think we lose the value addition of how foreign policy is perceived outside of those kinds of spaces. So I'm grateful, and please feel free to interrupt me during my 15 to 20-minute presentation. I prefer interactive engagement, dialogue, etc. So that's the key to how I see the learning outcomes in any engagement with students and the university community at large. So with that, I don't want to ramble on too much. So I think when I was conceptualizing, what would I talk about in terms of South Africa's foreign policy objectives in Mozambique, I felt that Mozambique is a story of South Africa's foreign policy, and more importantly, the architecture of South Africa's foreign policy and how that architecture is built. it's a microcosm of how South Africa's foreign policy goes through these ebbs and flows. What is stated policy, what is stated objectives, what is stated vision, and the clash that has in terms of realities on the ground. And I think that when we look at South Africa's foreign policy, it's a much bigger existential project. It's a much bigger set of complementarities, inconsistencies, contradictions, tensions, as well as when I first started off in my academic studies, I had a very profound professor and mentor, Professor John Daniel, who, by the way, came from Rhodes University and taught me in my postgraduate years at the University of Durban Westville, now called UKZN, and made very profound statements on what is South Africa's identity and its identitional power when it comes to foreign policy. And we kept having these debates. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Sorry. Can everybody please mute themselves? Can everybody please just mute themselves? Sorry, Sanyusha, you may continue.
No, it's okay. That's it. So I think there's this constant debate about how does South Africa see its role in terms of foreign policy? What are the drivers, the factors, the value propositions that define it? And most importantly, is there an ambiguity between what it perceives its role to be, how it inculcates that role in practice, and this idea that South Africa becomes almost frightened to demonstrate what its prowess is in its foreign policy? And it's quite interesting because I come to this conversation just having been in a seminar that the Institute for Global Dialogue hosted. And I'll share the recording with your colleagues in the department. And of course, they'll share it with you. And then, of course, those that want to join the mailing list of the Institute for Global Dialogue, you can do so with the link to my colleague, Arina Murison. And the interesting debate we were having there right now was whether or not South Africa's foreign policy value proposition gets caught up in its identity of what its positioning is in the world. If we take that one step down and we percolate it to what is South Africa's positioning in the region, there's a very fundamental document or article that was written by the former Trade and Investment Minister, Dr. Rob Davies, in 1991. And it was built on the article that Professor John Daniel, myself, and another colleague at the Human Sciences Research Council wrote, called "The South Africans Have Arrived, the Post-Apartheid Corporate Expansion." And we looked at those three scenarios that Dr. Davies put in that journal article, which was published by the Journal of Southern African Studies. And the question was, what would be South Africa's identity, role, behavior, and positioning in Southern Africa after 94? And he laid out three scenarios. It could take a very parochial approach, completely a hegemonic, narrow interpretation of putting its own vested interests first to the detriment of the region, and behave just like its apartheid predecessor. Or it could basically temper down that identity, but still, in terms of its interests, make sure its vested interests are first and foremost addressed, and then look at it as a kind of limited partnership. The preferred option that Dr. Davies proposed in the article was a complete benign, almost a kind of everything we do is based on and that pivot in Africa is essentially that our foreign policy agenda and our foreign policy successes and opportunities is intimately linked to how we drive the peace, stability, and development.
See you next year or not.
Hi, Frida. Okay, she's muted.
I'll just unmute myself. So how South Africa will always look at the region and Africa as a pivot in its foreign policy, that its main approach is an Africa first approach. And everything that it does is linked to the fact that we are doing it in the collective interest of the continent and the region and the continent. And it was quite an interesting point, because the issue we were trying to raise, and we came to the conclusion in that article, and I'll share that with Tupelo and colleagues, is South Africa was more about partnership, collaboration, collective interest, that its national interest was about the region, that its national interest was about environment and so forth. And that essentially the whole question of where South Africa was going was that it did not want to be like its apartheid predecessor, destructive, completely arrogant and racist and so forth. And I think that was what it was linked to. It was linked to the idea that the states in the region, in the Southern African region, had to deal with this giant, which was essentially a destabilizing actor and destabilized the region in terms of economic development, in terms of social development, in terms of how it only looked out for its own region based on the policies of the apartheid state, which was total strategy, total onslaught. And South Africa, and post-apartheid South Africa was very, very nervous about the perception of it being an extension of the apartheid state. What was interesting, and I want to mention that because I think it sets a very important foundation, and it sets a very important context for the relationship South Africa has with the region in a post-apartheid state, post-94, and the relationship it has with the region today, and what influences that? Who makes the decisions on this relationship? What interests define this relationship? What factors drive the relationship? How do elites connect with each other in this relationship? Foreign policy is not just about or only about the state. It is about a range of actors that play a critical role in forming what kind of engagement you drive with the region. And there are disconnects. And the disconnects are quite interesting. I want to start with the disconnects. I think the disconnects are essentially how much does South Africa feel guilty about its past, particularly the whole question of apartheid South Africa destroyed the region, post-apartheid South Africa is trying to develop the region. Secondly, the other disconnect is understanding the regional dynamics and how the region perceives a post-apartheid South Africa. It's not enough that liberation unites you. The liberation struggle in Southern Africa has gone through its exercise of motions. It's gone through this idea, this notion that we're still in that kind of space between the first and second generational set of leaders immediately after the post-independence context. So we kind of caught in this notion, or in this kind of revolving door, swing door between the post-independent nationalism and that first generational set of leaders and political institutions like liberation movements turned political parties. That's still a very much part of that broader, bigger dynamic of nationalism, and the parties that have remained dominant in the region. And so if you look at the regional dynamics on democracy and good governance and questions of all of that, it's still very much caught in not finding its traction. We can have Zimbabwe as an example. We can have Angola as an example. We can have Mozambique as an example. We can have even Botswana, even though Botswana has been cited as a kind of innovative, a kind of mover and shaker in the region in terms of its domestic politics. It's still caught up in a domestic political crisis in terms of how those liberation movements and political parties still dominate the electoral landscape, but still dominate the political landscape. Whether you talk about ZANU-PF, whether you talk about Frelimo in Mozambique, whether you talk about MPLA in Angola, whether you talk about SWAPO in Namibia, it's that dynamic. South Africa comes into this region as this newly emerged democratic state. And immediately, it's the kind of traction that the international system conveys to South Africa. It's seen as this country that did the most incredible thing. It had this political transition. This transition was based on the first citizen, Nelson Mandela, and he became this champion of human rights. And so our foreign policy was predicated on the idea that we will always do the right thing in international relations. We'll always be a normative actor. We'll always uphold the constitutional values of our democracy. We'll always be pivoted towards the principles of democratization and the rights and the human rights agenda. And that's what became an interesting test case in 94, after 94, was when South Africa had to choose between whether it stays with Taiwan as a diplomatic relationship or it shifts and recognizes Beijing in terms of the one China policy. So that was the first litmus test of this human rights issue in South African foreign policy. And it grappled. Mandela grappled. He grappled a lot. I mean, Mandela as the ever engaging statesman, the statesman whose identitional power was quite interesting, and the person that essentially came through. It was quite interesting to see that, you know, he couldn't convince Beijing that you could have recognition of both Taiwan and Beijing. It was non-negotiable for Beijing. You either chose Taiwan or you chose Beijing. So the one China policy became that litmus test of why would you go and decide that I will switch diplomatic ties from Taipei to Beijing and essentially recognize Beijing as the one China that represents all of the Chinese territories, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Macau, and now we know about Hong Kong and the whole transfer of power to Beijing after the British left in the late 1990s, and so forth. But I think the real issue is that it wasn't just in the global arena that we tested that the human rights pivot in the foreign policy. It was also tested with Nigeria, when Mandela stood up and criticized the former military leader when they executed the human rights activists in Nigeria. And he did it at a Commonwealth meeting. That was a no-go. The continent kind of didn't support it, continental leaders, and including leaders in Southern Africa. So South Africa's identity in the region is constantly battling perceptions, constantly trying to fit in, but also realizing that some of its structural conditions at the domestic level, the inequalities, the fact that you could have, using Thabo Mbeki's famous quote, "We are a country of two nations, one developed and one underdeveloped," the opening line of Charles Dickens' novel, I think was quite interesting, because that identity comes back many a time for whether South Africa is able to achieve that push forward in terms of its regional footprint, its regional dynamics. And of course, Mugabe always reminded South Africa that you have to integrate into what we have as SADC institutions, as Southern African institutions. You can't come into these institutions and dictate the terms. So that peace, stability, and development was never one that synchronized completely and synergized completely with South Africa's democratization and good governance. It happened at the global level, because South Africa post-apartheid South Africa inherited a very interesting economic state. It inherited a state that was, at that time, South African corporates were movers and shakers in the continent. They were the leaders in the retail sector. They were the leaders in the construction and infrastructure sector. Their investment in Southern Africa and Africa by South African corporates were moving in major ways. But it was private sector. It was the white capital that was moving in. Also, there was this whole tension around aligning whether South Africa would use that might to be much more prescriptive about the region. And I think that's what always emerges in the back of South Africa's mind, is that it doesn't want to be that prescriptive. Fast forward to the Thabo Mbeki years, I think it was understanding that Mandela was, this icon, this human rights champion. So as much as the region led by Mugabe pushed back, it wasn't really only Mugabe that pushed back. I think there was also the question of how do you manage the relationship? So you have Mbeki coming up with the African Renaissance Project. You have Mbeki talking about we cannot be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty. You have Mbeki talking about the ideas that we need to change the OAU into the transformative AU. Remember, into the big racism, anti-racism conference in Durban, the whole AU charter, the constitutive act of the AU. And Mbeki was very interesting. He was very strategic. He chose particular leaders like Obasanjo, like Bouteflika, he managed to create interesting relationships with when he was in Lusaka, and essentially tried to push that through. I think we have to also, as a sidebar, point to make, we've got to recognize that Kenneth Kaunda was an incredible friend, an incredible supporter of the South African government, the ANC-led government, because of their relationship in exile and in Lusaka, where the ANC was the de facto government in exile. So I think in many of those ways, what we have is Mbeki trying to understand the structural conditions. And so making sure that South Africa doesn't always, find itself caught between a rock and a hard place, and as conversations that were happening in under the Mbeki years as well, is whether South Africa could be a hegemonic actor or it needed to be a pivotal actor, a pivotal state, is that it needed to shape it, but not to basically prescribe and not to become a kind of Americanized actor in the region. But our corporates were very, very powerful. You had DSTV moving out into the continent. You had MTN, incredibly powerful campaign. You had all kinds of things happening with our corporate sector. And so South African corporates were quite trailblazers in many parts of the continent, and particularly the Southern African region became an interesting backyard for them in many ways. I remember in Kenya, when I was there doing some research in around about 2000, 2001, or just after, the president at the time, I think, was Daniel Arap Moi. But South African capital wasn't just moving in terms of the retail manufacturing. They were also moving in terms of land. They were buying up land, or they were entering into lease agreements. And in Kenya, there was this major debate about whether you allow SAB to come in, because you needed to keep South African corporates out, because if you allow South African corporates to come in, they change the national identity. It was an identity issue that South African corporates will come in and they will just take over. Similar questions were happening in Mozambique. When I was there as well, doing a paper on the Mozambique peace accord that was signed in 2001, there was this incredible amount of South African farmers, white farmers, Afrikaner farmers that were basically going into Maputo and going up north and into Maputo, into other parts of the country, and taking on land deals, etc. The tourism industry was quite interesting. I think it was called Southern Sun International at the time, not Tosogo Sun as we see today. But these were moving into the continent. And so there was this question about whether what corporate South Africa was doing represented the government's position on Africa and the region. And I think Mbeki understood that you needed to temper those issues. They tried to contain it. I mean, talk about South African mercenaries in Mozambique. South African mercenaries were basically all over the region. They were offering their services to companies to basically provide peace and security, stabilize gas oil fields and pipelines and all of that. And South Africa became nervous under the Mbeki era. And they passed this law called the Prevention of Private Military and Security Personnel, because there was a company called Executive Outcomes, which was essentially a paramilitary company set up by ex-SADF guys. And so it was an incredible amount of things to try and get South Africa to kind of align to what its regional objectives were. And that regional objectives was to basically understand that we were part of an integrated approach. We were never an exception, or we didn't need to be an exception. I think the Mbeki years essentially it caught the essence of South African foreign policy, because it brought in the APRM, it brought in the whole thing around the economic development. So peace, stability, and development was really the question of peace, stability, and economic development. How do you develop the continent, the investment trajectory? That it wasn't just investment for South Africa, it was investment for regional projects under NEPAD, that you needed good governance, the APRM, the whole AU, OAU to AU, all of that was quite the kind of democratization, good governance mirror of the peace, stability, and development agenda that South Africa was looking at. And of course, interventions in peacekeeping missions and so forth. Let's fast forward to the Zuma years, because I'm looking at time and I have about 5 minutes. If we fast forward to the Zuma years, I think the Zuma foreign policy became much more about how the perception of risk at the domestic level filtered into the foreign policy. I think what happened with South Africa's corporate footprint is that the region and the continent that's north of the Limpopo started to see the cracks in our domestic environment, started to see how we were engaging in the same challenges that they had. And I'm not talking about elites, I'm talking about ordinary Africans in capitals like Windhoek, like Harare, like Maputo, in Luanda, and even in the DRC, even up in Kenya. When we used to go and do our research, they would constantly ask us, tell us about what's happening in your domestic setting, because you're not this coherent country that we assume, or the perception puts out there. The incoherence of our foreign policy came out in the Zuma era. It started to emerge at the tail end of the Mbeki era, but the Mbeki era was very much about the coherence. We may not have had the kind of recipe for our economic development and socioeconomic challenges at the domestic level, but in the foreign policy, there was much more coherence, in my opinion, that is. And so in the Jacob Zuma years, I think we got caught up with so much that was happening at the domestic level that the nesting of foreign policy became an extension of that domestic issues, the incoherence, the challenges, the way in which the influence happened. And into that, we must remember the reactions South Africans had, and even what ministers were saying about foreign economic migrants coming in from other Southern African economies. The xenophobia became quite an interesting dynamic. And it starts off at the tail end with regard to the Mbeki era. And I think this is where South Africa finds itself caught, because it wants to take 3 or 4 steps forward. But when it takes 1 step forward, it then takes 10 steps back, because the other African countries, the elites and ordinary citizens, know what South Africa's Achilles heel is. And that is, you hit South Africa and say, you're still racist, you haven't transformed. The ownership of assets is still very much controlled by a minority group, and the South African government gets very scared and they pull back. So I think coupled with all of that, we come to the Ramaphosa era. And I think Ramaphosa is a nostalgic president. He also is nostalgic in terms of how economic diplomacy in the region, as well as economic diplomacy and commercial diplomacy, informs his foreign policy. He wants to bring back investment. He's got this investment conference that goes on. Questions is when it's going to happen this year. He's about how the investment is going to grow the economy. But at the same time, he realizes that South Africa's pivot is about the fact that it's a member of the G20, vaccine diplomacy, the fact that Africa is no longer the Africa of 94. The region is no longer the region of 94. South Africa is not this literal gateway into the region anymore. It needs to rethink some of these gateway perceptions it has. But I think what happens is that there's a disconnect between policy and practice. There's a disconnect in terms of stated objectives and what is achievable in practice. And the point I want to end here, because I want the Q&A and you can ask me to expand on these issues, is the fact that our operationalization of foreign policy objectives is caught between the issue of how the domestic environment and reforms have been held back by things like whether we have a professionalized foreign service, whether we have capable foreign policy personnel, the deployment strategy of the ANC, and how that affects our foreign policy outputs. What's our stated value propositions? Is it the same as elite interests? Does it align to what our national interests are? Where do we fit DIRCO in all of this? Is DIRCO just a coordinating agency? It's the question of operationalization, coupled with the bureaucracy that Ramaphosa doesn't have control over in his state. And then, of course, you've got this notion between party and state. Where does the party start? Where does the state end? If you go and you look at the ANC resolutions from since 2000, or say since 1990, or even before, after that, there are quite a few resolutions that keep repeating themselves in subsequent elective conferences. One of them is the position on Palestine, and of course, the question of Western Sahara. The point I want to make here is when Morocco was kicked out of the AU because of the Western Sahara issue, South Africa was quite vocal and wanted that because of its positioning on Western Sahara. But when Morocco was applied to get for readmission, Jacob Zuma was asked at the AU Assembly of States meeting, why are you objecting to this? Because Morocco applied, it got lobbied, it got all the votes that it needed in terms of a quorum to basically be readmitted into the AU. Jacob Zuma stood at the AU Assembly meeting, and I think it was the chairperson at the time, could have been Alpha Condé, who has now been deposed as the Guinea leader by the military coup. And Jacob Zuma said, but we don't want this because it's not in our foreign policy objectives. And the chairperson said to him, well, Mr. Zuma, President Zuma, it is what you want. It's the fact that the AU has followed process, Morocco has followed processes, and it's being readmitted. The same thing with Israel being given observer status at the institution. I think the problem we have in our foreign policy is whether or not South Africa needs to understand its bureaucratic nature, understand who is where, understand what the situational analysis in the region, because the region is moved away from South Africa. The region is hesitant about South Africa. The fact of the matter is, I think Ramaphosa is trying to bring it back. But then you look at Rwanda and what Rwanda is engaging. You look at Frelimo. Frelimo is split, but there's still that question of don't interfere in my sovereignty. You look at the fact that South Africa dropped the ball on the SADC tribunal. And I think it tries to accommodate the region because it's so scared of this ambiguity in its foreign policy. And this ambiguity has now turned into incoherence. So I think the problem we're having is what's happening at the domestic level and how it's impacting on our stated objectives, whether in Southern Africa or in broader Africa or in the global arena, but also whether the quality of our diplomats and who is being sent to different strategic missions and sent abroad to represent us in branding our vision. Is it basically aligning? And I think that's where the expectations of elites kind of enter into the unimaginative area that we are an exception. We're not an exception. I think even the ANC thinks it's an exception at times. And I say this because I'm not being provocative, because I think that they've shown that this exceptionalism has become their weakness. When you listen to ministers as well, at times, they're not talking to each other. Ministries are not talking to each other. DIRCO is not talking to DTIC. DTIC is doing its own economic diplomacy. DIRCO is doing its own economic diplomacy. So this coherence is not even happening amongst ministries, even in the different agencies, different desks at DIRCO. If China is your most strategic actor, you only have 4 people on the China desk. The people who are sitting in China in the mission, that has been problematic. DIRCO is going through budget cuts because there's a domestic reform agenda that National Treasury is engaging in. But at the end of the day, I think the synchronization of our objectives in foreign policy based on what's happening on the ground is just not connecting. Let me stop there and then I can take more questions.
Oh no. Thank you for that, Samisha. I almost forgot about the time actually, but I think it was an excellent presentation. Without sort of imposing myself, anybody with a question or comment, please send it either through chat or raise your hand, and we take it from there. Dagan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for that really in-depth presentation. I'm really interested in this idea of the incoherence of South Africa's foreign policy towards the region and the continent at large. I just want to gather your thoughts on sort of the process that is unfolding within Mozambique and South Africa's involvement in that process via SADC. Mm-hmm. In July, they sent, I think it was 1,500 troops at a cost of 1 billion rand, which to me seems like a very large reaction to what was unfolding there when the town of Palma, fell to the insurgency that was going on in that region. Mm-hmm. I think that, if South Africa had been more proactive, if it had taken more of a leadership role within SADC, at an earlier stage, that this insurgency has been going on since 2017, that it wouldn't get to a stage now where, it's sent 1,500 troops at a cost of 1 billion rand when, domestically we have much better things that money could be spent on. I just want to know your thoughts on South Africa's involvement in the process and why the process has unfolded the way it has.
Do you want to take a series of questions or should I just do a immediate response?
I think it depends on you, but at the moment, okay. I think there's a bit of shyness. But I mean, I do also have a question. It's just relating to, given, the way you've constructed or sort of presented South Africa's foreign policy on the continent and the region. I mean, what do you make then of, the statements that we've made with regards to Mozambique, with the insurgency happening there? What is and what ought to be our response there? I just want to take all of the sort of context that you brought in and then to bear on that crisis.
Let me say that the starting point of that is South Africa has to conform to what the regional dynamic is. And the regional dynamic is SADC. Now, you would have been informed, or in the presentations in the week, that South Africa is now heading up the organ on politics, defense, and security, and that organ is quite instrumental. But the idea that South Africa could do this on its own is not necessarily a collective response, because it has to basically look at what the regional response is. And the regional response is still very much the question of whether you allow, you go in and you challenge the sovereignty of the Frelimo government. Within the Frelimo government, I've been hearing that they split. Those that want reforms, those that want the sovereignty to stay. And what I found very interesting is, based on the mapping that I did and the kind of contextual analysis that I just provided, this is where South Africa feels nervous to be bold enough to say, you know what, we need to shape this, we need to move this. We can't continuously have SADC decide and defer to what's happening, because there's a regional crisis here. the regional crisis is not only about what's happening internally in Mozambique and in the northern region, but it's also about the spillover regional security threats. One of them being the way in which the Cabo Delgado corridor has been used for drug trafficking, and that those drugs are coming into South Africa and is causing other kinds of security threats and implications for our socioeconomic landscape. The problem is that South Africa feels nervous, as I said, also because I think that Mozambique has been, or the authorities in Mozambique have been shaping that narrative in terms of how SADC is reacting to them. So the consultative approach has not really worked out. So you got this deployment strategy, and I know it's an outcry because we've got a serious socioeconomic challenge. I know our economy is in such a dire set of constraints that people are basically losing livelihoods. People's lives and livelihoods are in such precarious situation. But we have this responsibility to go and deploy in Mozambique. If we take that out of the equation, I think the problem is that South Africa's model of this peace, security, and development, and this idea of brokering a transitional agenda. And if you listen to Vasu Goundan from Accord, he makes a very valid point. He says, one of the things that South Africa, what we have to do is understand that a transitional model has to have a transformation agenda. And if South Africa has to go and say to the Mozambicans, well, there's no transformation here. What are the people in the northern region fighting for? They're fighting for inclusion. They're fighting for job security. They're fighting for the same socio-economic issues and the precariat issues we have in South Africa. It's the same issue. So our transition has not been that model of always being foolproof. And I think it hits home of what's happening in our own environment in terms of poverty, inequality, marginalization, vulnerability, and just not being able to secure our own society in terms of what this transitional model and the CODESA talks and all of that was about. And it hits home very hard. That's the one area of how South Africa becomes nervous. The other issue is that there's this disconnect. The disconnect that the people in South Africa, have to their own governance structures, the trust deficit of our own governance architecture, of our institutions, of our political parties. If you saw the Afrobarometer survey about 4 weeks ago that came out with new data about how low the trust deficit is across political parties and institutions of the state, it's the same thing in the region. This disconnect between elites and ordinary citizens. And I think that the vested interest in democracy is being put on under the spotlight. And to a large extent, I think South Africa finds itself nervous because if it goes in there and says, no, you need to do this, and these are the issues, the immediate reaction is, well, how much have you achieved in your own democracy, in your own democratic experience and transition? So I think those are some of the structural conditions. The third issue is really the question of how empowered is the SADC institution as a regional bloc? Because you're still sitting with the remnants of those political parties, liberation movements turned political parties. And as one of my Kenyan colleagues always reminds me, you are not an exception to the rule as the ANC. You may have had Mandela, but that doesn't make you exceptional. The idea is that you are going through the same political transformation crises that we are going through as well. Just that your model is not foolproof, that you're still sitting in that crisis. Look at the ANC today, look at the challenges they're having. I think for me, when I think about how to conceptualize where we are in our domestic political landscape, the best I could say is, if you read the book, It's Our Turn to Eat by Michaela Wrong on Kenya's political landscape and the corruption issues, all you have to do is change the name of the political party and change the actors, and you'll have South Africa. Because I think that's where we are. So we kind of come to the party late, but then we kind of find it difficult to try and say, well, we know what needs to be done, because we then have this question of being, well, hang on, have you achieved it? Have you achieved your kind of issues? And that opens up the opportunity for parties who talk the kind of connect with the sections of the population, like the economic freedom fighters. If you look at their regional footprint as well, it's quite interesting. I hope I've answered the question.
Yes. Okay, there's another question. Spokazi, I see you, but let me just go to Tato. I'm hoping that, okay, there are two questions really, so I'm going to read them out, Samisha. I hope that's fine. There are two questions on the chat, and there's a hand there from Spokazi, so I'm gonna start with the chat. Okay. So the first one is from Tato. Tato, I know you're listening, you'll help me if I'm reading you correctly. So, well, taking into account the sovereignty of each state and the principle of non-intervention, is the response of South Africa prompted by the Mozambican government, and the purpose of public policy? Is it to govern how we as South Africa respond to foreign problems when prompted to intervene? But then I've asked her to rephrase, I don't know, because I couldn't quite get the last two sentences. She rephrased the saying that is the purpose of foreign policy to govern and set out objectives of how South Africa responds to foreign problems that may arise in other states such as Mozambique when prompted to intervene. So that's the first question. I'm going to skip Peter. Yeah, it's a bit off from the topic. So we're gonna go to Oyama. Okay, so I'm gonna just relay saying, please thank Ms. Naidu for an interesting presentation. And the question is that, could you please contrast the different roles that South Africa and Nigeria play within their respective regional bodies, SADC and ECOWAS, and if there are any tips South Africa can learn in terms of foreign policy from Nigeria? The reason why this question is top of mind is because how, for instance, ECOWAS has been active in banning countries from the bloc when they're coups and intervening militarily to fight jihadism in the region, whereas SADC doesn't have such instances. Why is this the case? I think those are the two questions. Then I think after then we can go to Spokazi. I hope that's fine.
Okay. Should I take the two questions and then?
Yeah, I think take the two questions, then we can come to Spokazi afterwards.
Okay, lovely.
Sure.
Let's start with the easier question first about contrasting Nigeria and South Africa in their respective regional blocs. I think ECOWAS has a very interesting approach. I mean, if you look at ECOWAS and you look at how ECOWAS constructs itself, in terms of economic, let me start with the economic integration agenda. It's really moved ahead in terms of, you know, the common franc, in terms of the ECOWAS visa, passport, free movement of people, and so forth. But the instability of that region is quite dynamic in terms of responding to the political dynamics. I think Nigeria for the longest time had been that kind of, you know, dominant actor in that region. But there are other actors that have moved up. If you look at Ghana, if you look at Senegal, and if you look at the response of ECOWAS to the latest coup, I mean, they've been very proactive, if that's the right word to use, to essentially say to countries that have challenged the political stability of the region, to say that we're not going to basically deal with this, we're going to take action. But I think Nigeria has also grappled at the domestic level with Boko Haram. And in the northern parts of Nigeria, if you look at how these movements, these organizations, these insurgents have been destabilizing the Nigerian state in terms of the kidnapping of girls and children, and asking for ransom and so forth. And I think the Nigerian political landscape has gone through its own ebbs and flows. And with Buhari also now, you know, been challenged in terms of his own political dynamic, his governance. And Nigeria is a very fluid society. It's a very fragmented society, and the kinds of issues that are happening there. I mean, if you think about the way the jihadist movements or the way the insurgents movements work in terms of the kind of drug corridors that are happening, the way they're controlling logistics sites and overland logistic transport corridors and moving into the whole kind of west coast of the drug trafficking trade and the drug corridors. It's almost like you've got two interesting dynamics. You've got the Cabo Delgado region here on the northern corridor to the Indian Ocean linkages to trafficking of drugs, and you've got the western corridor here on the Atlantic side, linking up to places in terms of across the Atlantic between South America and that area. I think there's a lot of interesting parallels between the two, and I think Nigeria also has to, in many ways, it grapples with its internal domestic affairs. I think I saw recently, and I stand corrected, where Buhari made a very interesting point about becoming tougher on some of these issues. And people said, oh, for the first time, Buhari has shown some mettle. So I think those domestic arrangements in Nigeria kind of also act as an interesting parallel with South Africa's domestic arrangements and how much of that influences that region. So there is that difference. I think in ECOWAS, there's a little bit more traction. You do have countries, as I mentioned, Senegal and so forth. I think in Southern Africa, the challenge is, as a colleague of mine said to me today on the discussion from ISS, she commented and she said, she was told that where SADC is today is where the OAU was before it transitioned into the AU. So there's that sense of what transition is going to happen in SADC and how that transition is going to take place in terms of institutional strength, architecture, and so forth. What I find important linked to the question of sovereignty and so forth is how much are we going to see that traction move forward? How are we going to see what's happening at the domestic level in countries where there's a pushback by frustrated citizens, and the role of civil society and the role of media, etc., and the role of SADC institutions. I mean, if you go into the SADC secretariat, I don't know where it is now, but you kind of get the separation between the integration agenda, which is the regional indicative development plan, which is the one thing on the integration. But then the organ on politics is where the bigger political sovereignty bun fights happen around power of states and leaders and so forth. So it's how do you gel those two? And I hope I'm answering that question in terms of the institutional architecture. What are the objectives of South African foreign policy? Is it to essentially respond to political issues or foreign policy issues or foreign policy problems? I think it's not about responding, it's about how it aligns to what your interests are. I think South Africa's foreign policy is built on the architecture that it derives from the constitutional principles of being a normative actor in terms of the reform agenda of the multilateral, and linking that to institutional reform, both in the context of the region and the AU and the peace and security, and aligning those multilateral institutions to the AU, to the regional institutions. I think where you have to look at the pivots in South African foreign policy, where it's about the national interest, is how it links to your national development plan, how it links to your interests around creating a South African Development Partnership Agency, which has been in the works, in the pipeline for so long. It's about the South African Council of International Relations, which we know, has been disbanded now. But it's about what it is you want to achieve in the international arena. Is your stated objectives and the region, continent, and broader global architecture, what is your objectives? What do you want to achieve? Do you want to basically create a just transition or a just reformed, transformed international society? We keep banding around these words called international progressive, internationalism. What's this internationalism? Where is the narrative? What's your identitional power? What's your identity? What is it that you want? And I don't think it's only about how you align yourself to foreign policy challenges or in international relations, or what is your response to those challenges, but it's also about how does it create your position in the world in terms of who are the actors? Because our international relations architecture is a moving target. It's changing constantly. There's new competitors, both economic and political. You've got different transitions, different changes happening. Look at the Middle East. You've got, in your own region, you've got changes happening at a very fast pace. How do you keep abreast of that? And I think it has to align to what not just your philosophical objectives are and your philosophical values are, but what is your practical? How do you bring that relationship between your operationalization of how you want to respond in the world?
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Sanusha. Spogazi?
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, Sanisha, for this very rich overview of almost 30 years of South African foreign policy making and the meeting of idealism and reality. And of course, part of the idealism that could exist, during Madiba and Mbeki's time was because there was no questioning of the liberal order, whereas for Zuma and Ramaphosa, they come at a time where that order is under critique and even in crisis. And so, Lauren Nathan makes this point that there's no community of security in Southern Africa or in SADC. It's a community of insecurity, and a lot of it, as you've outlined, is driven by the domestic challenges that SADC members face. And I wonder, you say a number of times that the ANC and South Africa are not an exception, and it's true, that the difference perhaps is that it took them longer than other countries to achieve independence, right? And that story of liberation movements in Africa is not glamorous, and it does not have a happy ending. And so I am asking you, because I think about this a lot, are we destined towards that disastrous fate that we know about what has happened to liberation movements in Africa, where the ending is often violence and often war? And now it is a thought that I don't think we can honestly say we are not heading that way, because to me, more and more as we sit in this crisis, it seems that we're heading there. What needs to happen to change that destiny domestically and within the region? Thank you.
Wow. So because it's always lovely to interact with you, and again, fantastic, thought-provoking question of what the scenario looks like as we move forward. I would like to think that we're not heading into that kind of situation in terms of the community of insecurity. I'm afraid that as long as the ANC is more preoccupied with its own internal issues. I mean, I don't know if you saw this yesterday or one of the days, there was an interview on one of the news channels, and they interviewed Pule Mabe, the ANC spokesperson, and he was talking about these court challenges. And and then he said, "Well, you're not paying your staff their salaries." And he said, "Well, we're not paying their staff," and I'm paraphrasing, and I could be paraphrasing a bit incorrectly here, so I stand corrected. He said, "But we're not paying our staff because we're a donor organization." And it just didn't make sense, because the two are not related, But I think they're so caught up in that internal dynamic that there's a rhetoric in the party, and they talk that rhetoric. But when we talk about what needs to be done in terms of organizational renewal, in terms of maybe there needs to be a new dawn in the ANC, and if there's a new dawn in the ANC, it will eventually become a new dawn for the state. They're disconnected from these things. And I think that's the problem. The problem is the leadership in the region is disconnected. There's an elite set of interests, and those elite interests are being governed by hanging on to these political institutions, particularly the parties, and how these parties have been constructed over time. And they're disconnecting with what's happening on the ground. And so why do we have I don't want to call them insurgencies. I think these are people that are genuinely fighting for their socio-economic inclusion. The fact of the matter is, what happened in Mozambique is not the first time the region has gone through this. We look at Zimbabwe. We look at Angola, we look at the DRC, we look at Namibia. I mean, there's a movement against this. Younger people, younger generation, the millennial generation are not as loyal to these parties as we thought, as maybe mine or previous generations were, because these parties haven't connected with them. And I think the problem is, once there is that self-realization in the ANC and in the regional leadership, and if you are going to include younger people in the regional dynamic of leadership, don't include them for the sake of ticking boxes, because that's just a checkbox way of dealing with things. South African foreign policy has also been doing that. They've been ticking boxes. You know, when you go and you look at all the documentation that is there at Parliament when they report on oversight, it's a checkbox to foreign policy tick. That's what they do. We've been invited to do this. We've been invited to do that. We hosted this. We hosted that. That's not foreign policy. And I think for me, that's the bigger challenge. The bigger structural challenge in the region is, how do we avert this coming set of insecurity and this conflict that you mentioned? I don't think leaders are listening. There's an incredible activist here in Cape Town who is a climate change activist. And she's 18 years old and she sits on the president's climate change advisory group. And she says when she goes into meetings, there's a generational gap, but there's also a very interesting gender issue, because she's 18 years old and she's young. They don't think she has anything of value to give, because you got these older patriarchal sets of individuals and circles of connections and leadership issues and people who are in positions of power who are not listening to the younger generation, and also the gender question. So I think at the end of the day, it's a wake-up call. You don't want the region to become, Mozambique should not become the bigger macro picture of the region. Well, you got to sit up and start thinking how you're going to avert this, because at the moment, you're not doing that.
Okay, thank you, Sanyisha. We've come to the end, but I don't know if there are any pressing questions or comments that I have made that maybe I missed in the chat, or perhaps somebody wanted to say as a parting shot in the seminar. If there aren't, then I'd like to say thank you so much to Sanyisha. This was the fourth and final installment of the teaching series, and I think they've been quite fantastic in terms of the presentations and the speakers. And today I liked the overview that gave both historical and context to the issues of Mozambique, but also just the region. Thank you again to everybody who came through, for the attendees, to the students. Yeah, and from the department, thank you, Sanyisha. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And maybe, you know, it's incredible. I will share whatever resources I have with you, and you can share with the students and your colleagues in the department. And I'll ask my colleague Arena to maybe put you on the mailing list, so that when you get our information for webinars and reports, then you can share it with everybody in the room. I just want to make one last point about the liberal order. I think the point about, I remember, I forgot to mention this based on Supakazi's point about the liberal order. I think the challenge of the liberal order was coming for the longest time ever, even before the Jacob Zuma presidency came into being. I think it was challenged by the fact that you had, by around 2005, this issue about whether the governance of the narrative of the liberal international order was essentially inclusive. The problem is we've also adopted a model of the trickle-down effect. That's not the model that you need to transform or reform the international agenda around, because it's not resolving the transformation issue. And that also comes back to the regional dynamics and the foreign policy architecture and the relationship that these countries in Southern Africa have with each other.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
All right. All right then. Okay, I'm gonna close the seminar, guys. Take care and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.